They thought humanity was broken. They thought its teeth had been kicked in, its last breath stolen, choked by the cold vacuum of space. They had witnessed the fall of the sole defense fleet, the slow, agonizing demise of the Vanguard Ascendant, the last dedicated warship humanity possessed beyond the Sol system's immediate reach. They had watched as its shields flickered, then died, under the relentless, indifferent hammer blows of Cathar null cruisers, sleek black predators that moved with the predatory grace of sharks through the stellar ocean. They believed, with the utter conviction of a superior species, that the colony of New Viridia, clinging precariously to the mineral-rich crust of Xylos 7, would be next. And they were right, in a way. The Cathar arrived with no grand pronouncements, no demands for surrender. Their very presence was the demand. 27 vessels, each a kilometer of silent black intent, slipped from the FTL wake like wraiths shedding cloaks of starlight. They didn't hail, they didn't warn, they simply opened fire. Orbital defenses, hastily erected and woefully inadequate, dissolved into glittering dust. Automated gun platforms, designed to repel asteroid strikes and pirate raids, vaporized in plumes of superheated plasma. The air on Xylos 7, thin and metallic to begin with, thickened with the acrid scent of ozone and the distant screams of dying machinery. On the surface, in the primary mining hub of Argent City, the ground thrummed with the concussive echoes of distant bombardment. Dust, fine as powdered moon rock, sifted through ventilation shafts, coating every surface in a grimy gray film. The emergency lights, flickering with the strain on the power grid, cast long, distorted shadows of the huddled masses in the deep-bore shelters. Hope, a precious commodity, was running critically low. Communications were down, save for the occasional, desperate burst from a dying comm buoy, relaying the cold, hard facts. No reinforcements were coming. None could come. Humanity's distant homeworlds were reeling from their own Cathar incursions. New Viridia was an isolated, insignificant pinprick on a galactic map, left to twist in the wind. Their humiliation was palpable, a bitter taste in every mouth. The Cathar didn't even bother to land ground forces. They simply held orbit, their ships a silent, mocking judgment, occasionally lancing down a beam of coherent energy to obliterate another power conduit or a residential district. It was a slow, methodical strangulation, designed not just to destroy, but to break the spirit, to demonstrate the utter futility of resistance. They were watching, analyzing the dwindling energy signatures, the failing life support, the desperate, uncoordinated scrambles of the colonists. They were waiting for the last gasp, and then there it was. Not a warship, not a fighter, not even a repurposed freighter. It was the S-Deep Driller Mackay 3, a bulk-class deep space mining vessel currently docked at the orbital processing station, crippled by a stray plasma strike that had fused its primary FTL drive. It was a lumbering behemoth of a ship, designed for one purpose: to tear apart asteroids, to chew through planetary crusts, to extract raw minerals with unyielding, grinding force. Its hull was a patchwork of reinforced ferrosteel and ablative ceramite, designed to withstand micrometeoroid impacts and the immense stresses of high-yield plasma drills, not direct fire from a no-cruiser's primary energy projectors. It was slow. It was heavy. It was utterly, laughably unsuited for combat. Its crew, a hardened mix of deep space miners, geologists, and structural engineers, had watched the orbital slaughter from the deep driller's cramped bridge. They had seen their world die, piece by agonizing piece. They were not soldiers. They were blue-collar work hands, their hands calloused from years of working with heavy machinery, their minds trained to solve problems of extraction, of stress fractures, of thermodynamic efficiency. They understood rock. They understood pressure. They understood the sheer, brutal force required to break apart a celestial body. The Cathar, in their arrogant surveillance, registered the A-Deep Driller, Make 3rd, as nothing more than a derelict civilian vessel. Their long-range scans, precise and unblinking, reported no weapon signatures, no active combat systems. A slow, heavy, unarmed target, no threat. A nuisance, perhaps, to be dealt with after the colony had been sufficiently pacified. They saw only the shell. They did not see the furnace of desperate ingenuity beginning to ignite within its grimy utilitarian heart. They did not see the sparks of an idea, born of humiliation and a profound, stubborn refusal to yield. They did not see the glint in the eyes of men and women who, having lost everything, realized they had nothing left to lose. And sometimes that is when the truly dangerous things begin to happen. The silence on the bridge of the deep driller, Mackay III, was not the silence of despair, but of a terrible, dawning clarity. It was the moment a drowning man stops flailing and starts searching for the deep current, the hidden thermocline. Chief Engineer Aris Thorne, a man whose life had been spent coaxing impossible performance from overworked machinery, ran a calloused hand over a flickering console. His eyes, usually crinkled with the strain of reading schematics in dim light, were narrowed, alight with a dangerous, impossible thought. "We still have primary power," he rasped, his voice rough from recycled air and the lingering taste of defeat. "Auxiliary reactors are stable. Life support is nominal, for now." He wasn't talking to anyone in particular, more to the empty space where hope used to reside. But the other crew members, drawn by the raw intensity in his voice, turned. There was Geely, the ship's lead geologist, her face smudged with hydraulic fluid, her usual calm replaced by a fierce, protective fire. There was Kalen, the heavy machinery specialist, a mountain of a man whose hands could strip down a plasma drill or reroute a power conduit with equal precision. And there was the captain, old Delara Vance, her face a roadmap of hard-won experience, her gaze fixed on the distant, mocking Cathar ships. "The was deep driller," Thorne continued, a low, guttural hum rising in his chest, "is rated for high-density asteroid impacts. Its forward drills can chew through Class 9 ferrous rock. Its internal bracing is designed to withstand a full-bore coronal mass ejection, deflected." He paused, letting the raw facts sink in. "We've got redundant shielding on the primary excavation bay, and our resource accumulators. They can hold 1,000,000 tons of raw ore." The implication hung in the recycled air, heavy as slag. A mining ship, a lumbering beast built for endurance and brute force, not speed or finesse. The Cathar saw a target, the crew saw something else. A very, very large, very slow hammer. The first step was to strip it down, to shed every ounce of non-essential weight, to redistribute every kilogram of mass for maximum resilience. They began with the cargo holds, jettisoning processed ore and redundant supplies into the void, turning the immense, cavernous spaces into empty bellies waiting to be filled with something far more volatile. Then came the armor. Not new armor, but repurposed plating from the orbital station's destroyed defenses, from the skeletal remains of cargo freighters that had been caught in the initial Cathar assault. Using the S-Deep Driller's own repair drones, usually reserved for patching hull breaches, and the immense magnetic clamps of its docking arms, they began welding. Sparks rained down in the blackness, brilliant fleeting stars against the dull gray of the hull. The roar of the plasma torches, the clang of heavy metal on metal, became the ship's new heartbeat. The Cathar, still observing, still analyzing, registered the increased thermal signatures, the frantic, localized activity. Their sensors, calibrated for combat vessel signatures, saw only the erratic, uncoordinated efforts of desperate civilians. They logged it as salvage operations, perhaps, or a futile attempt at repair. They noted the shifting mass, the minor adjustments to the vessel's attitude. Still no weapon signatures, still no threat, a slow, dying gasp. But within the Sea-Deep Driller's belly, the transformation was accelerating. The massive, articulated arms designed for asteroid manipulation were being re-rigged. Their multi-jointed dexterity, usually used for precision placement of seismic charges, was now being directed toward something far more aggressive. The primary plasma cutters, meant for slicing through dense rock, were being reinforced, their conduits rerouted, their energy output pushed far beyond safe operating parameters. They wouldn't be precise, they wouldn't be elegant, but they would burn. The colossal ore processing centrifuges, designed to separate valuable minerals from inert rock, were next. Their internal chambers, built to withstand incredible rotational forces and immense internal pressures, were being emptied of their usual contents. Kalen, his face smeared with grease, his brow furrowed in concentration, oversaw the delicate but brutal process of recalibrating their magnetic containment fields. The idea was simple, horrifyingly so: turn the processing chambers into kinetic energy launchers. Instead of sifting ore, they would sift and then accelerate anything that could fit. Asteroid fragments, dense chunks of processed metal, even compacted waste. Anything heavy, anything fast, anything that could be spun up to incredible velocities and then ejected with catastrophic force. The hum of the ship's auxiliary reactors, once a gentle thrum, deepened into a resonant growl. The air, thick with the smell of ozone, burnt wiring, and human sweat, vibrated with a new, nascent power. They were building a siege engine, a blunt instrument of vengeance. They were taking the very tools designed for creation and bending them to destruction. They were taking their humiliation and forging it into a weapon. The Cathar watched, uncomprehending, as a mining vessel, slowly, painstakingly, began to shed its skin of civilian utility and reveal the monster beneath. A monster born not of advanced technology, but of pure, unadulterated human stubbornness. The deep driller, make Cheba. Third, had always been a symphony of grinding gears and humming conduits, a testament to industrial might. Now it was a cacophony. The air in its vast repurposed bays vibrated with the incessant whine of overloaded power conduits, the rhythmic clang of heavy plating being pounded into place, and the sharp metallic tang of plasma welding. Sleep was a luxury none could afford, food a fuel to be consumed without thought, and every waking moment was dedicated to the grim, impossible task. Chief Engineer Eris Thorne moved through the ship like a phantom, his face gaunt, eyes bloodshot, but a fierce, almost manic energy driving him. He oversaw the recalibration of the forward plasma drills. These colossal mechanisms, originally designed to bore through kilometers of solid rock, were now being painstakingly realigned. Their focus arrays, once precise instruments for mineral extraction, were retuned for maximum energy projection. The result wasn't a beam, but a coherent, blistering torrent of superheated plasma, wide and devastating. They weren't precision instruments. They were bludgeons of pure energy, designed to scour and melt. The targeting systems were rudimentary, linked directly to the ship's navigation array, aiming crude but powerful. It wouldn't be a surgical strike. It would be a catastrophic burn. Below decks, in the primer ore processing bay, Gia-Li and Kalen spearheaded the most audacious modification. The two colossal centrifuges, each 100 meters in diameter, now stood empty, their internal mechanisms re-engineered for kinetic delivery. They scavenged. From the debris field around Xylos 7, they retrieved the dense metallic cores of destroyed orbital defense platforms. From the deep driller's own stores, they pulled thousands of tons of compacted high-density mining waste, slag, processed heavy metals, anything that had mass. These were fed into the centrifuges, not for separation, but for acceleration. The very machines designed to separate gold from dross were now preparing to hurl dross with the force of a gold-tipped missile. Kalen, covered in grime, watched the first test spin, the ground beneath him trembling as the immense circular chamber spun up, a low, building hum that vibrated through bone. The power draw was immense, almost crippling, but the promise of kinetic energy on that scale was intoxicating. The Cathar, still aloof, still disdainful, registered the deep driller's rising energy signatures. Their analytical subroutines flagged it as unusual power fluctuations, likely due to internal system failures or desperate uncoordinated repairs. Their long-range sensors, designed to detect active weapon hardpoints and energy signatures consistent with established combat protocols, found nothing that matched their parameters. No railguns, no proton torpedo launchers, no particle accelerators. Just a lumbering civilian hulk emitting confused, erratic signals. Their algorithms, honed by millennia of galactic conquest, simply could not compute such primitive desperation. It was beneath their notice, a dying insect twitching on a cosmic scale. The deep driller's external magnetic clamps, usually used for securing large ore chunks, were being reinforced, their power feeds boosted. They planned to use them as crude temporary shields, snatching up anything large and metallic from the debris field wreckage, even Cathar drone husks, and holding it against the hull as ablative armor. It was a suicide tactic, an act of sheer, bloody-minded defiance. Even the ship's environmental systems were being repurposed. Water purifiers were being bypassed to collect highly combustible methane gas from the planet's upper atmosphere, storing it in reinforced emergency fuel tanks. Waste heat from the reactors, usually vented, was now being directed into specialized conduits, heating sections of the hull to incredible temperatures, turning them into crude, short-range thermal projectors. It wasn't about elegant design. It was about brute-forcing every system, every component, into a role it was never intended to play. The atmosphere on the steep driller G was electric, thick with the scent of ozone, burnt wiring, and human sweat. The crew moved with a grim, focused intensity, their movements precise despite the exhaustion. They were driven not by orders, but by a shared, unspoken understanding. This was it. This was their last stand, their last chance to claw back a shred of dignity from the humiliation the Cathar had inflicted. They weren't fighting for victory, they were fighting for the right to die on their own terms, and perhaps, just perhaps, to take one of the bastards with them. The sea-deep driller, Mackay Thirds, once a symbol of humanity's quiet industriousness, was shedding its skin, transforming into a monstrous, improvised weapon, fueled by desperation and a profound, burning rage. TEC was no longer merely a ship. It was a testament to raw, unyielding will, forged in the fires of despair. Every spare lumen of power, every redundant system, every scrap of salvaged metal had been bent to a single, terrible purpose. The air was thick with the metallic tang of ozone and the acrid scent of burnt circuitry, a constant reminder of how far beyond their design parameters they were pushing every component. In the primary excavation bay, the colossal forward drills, now repurposed as plasma scourers, glowed with an internal, unstable energy. Eris Thorne, a thin film of sweat glistening on his forehead, watched as the final conduits were fused into place, bypassing a dozen safety protocols. The power flow was immense, drawn directly from the main fusion core, shunting energy away from life support and even the ship's grave dampeners. The hum of their re-engineered focusing arrays was a low, resonant growl, a predatory purr that vibrated through the deck plates. They were no longer precise tools for mineral extraction. They were crude, devastating projectors, capable of unleashing a torrent of superheated plasma that would melt through anything short of a Cathar primary shield. No finesse, just overwhelming brute force. Bellow in the cavernous holds of the ore-processing centrifuges, Jolly and Kalen oversaw the final loading. They had scoured the debris field around Xylos 7, collecting not just the metallic cores of destroyed defense platforms, but also sections of pulverized asteroid, dense and jagged. These were not projectiles, they were shrapnel generators. Each piece was deliberately fractured, designed to break apart upon impact, turning a single strike into 1,000 miniature, high-velocity impacts. The centrifuges, now kinetic accelerators, spun up, a low, building rumble that grew into a deafening roar. Thousands of tons of this improvised ammunition, ranging from pebble-sized fragments to multi-ton chunks, were fed into the massive chambers. The magnetic containment fields shrieked under the strain, barely holding the swirling, nascent storm of destruction within. When unleashed, these would not be targeted shots, but wide-area bombardments designed to shred unshielded hulls and pulverize anything in their path. The Cathar, still holding their imperious distant orbit, continued their analysis. Their sensors registered the ace-deep driller Mackay Third as a civilian vessel displaying unusually high, erratic internal energy fluctuations, consistent with catastrophic system failures and desperate attempts at damage control. They noted the shifting mass, the addition of external plating, but categorized it as scavenged debris, aesthetically unpleasing, tactically irrelevant. Their advanced algorithms, designed to detect sophisticated weapon signatures, found nothing. The very crudeness of the human modifications, the sheer audacity of repurposing such mundane equipment, rendered them invisible to the Cathar's refined detection protocols. They saw no threat, because their parameters simply did not allow for a threat that looked like a dying, industrially designed lump of metal. On the hull, the deep driller's massive external magnetic clamps, usually used for securing multi-ton ore chunks, were now functioning as crude, temporary shields. Crew members, tethered by safety lines, worked frantically in the vacuum, guiding massive pieces of salvaged freighter hull and even a damaged Qatar scout drone into place, clamping them against the steep driller's own hull. They wouldn't stop a direct hit, but they might deflect a glancing blow or absorb a particle burst, buying precious seconds. It was a desperate gamble, a frantic last-ditch effort to turn vulnerability into resilience. Captain Alara Vance stood on the bridge, her knuckles white as she gripped the navigation console. Her eyes, fixed on the distant, mocking Cathar formations, held no fear, only a cold, burning resolve. The hum of the ship, once familiar and comforting, was now a tense, vibrating thrum, a beast straining at its chains. The power readouts flickered, warning lights flashed across the consoles, but no one paid them heed. They were beyond warnings, beyond safety. The deep driller Mackay, third, slow and ponderous, began to move. Its maneuvering thrusters, designed for precise orbital adjustments, strained under the immense, shifted mass, pushing the vessel away from the station and towards the silent, arrogant fleet of the Cathar. It was not a charge. It was a lumbering, inevitable crawl. A defiance born not of strength, but of the absolute, bone-deep refusal to simply lie down and die. The Cathar watched its slow, erratic trajectory, their sensors interpreting it as a crippled vessel adrift, perhaps attempting a futile escape. They registered no weapons. They felt no fear. Not yet. The HD driller Mackay-30 crept through the void like a wounded leviathan, its battered hull a stark contrast to the pristine, obsidian forms of the Cathar fleet that loomed ahead. It wasn't a charge, not in the classical sense of naval engagement. It was an inevitability, a slow, grinding approach of a creature that knew it was going to die, but intended to make its death inconvenient. The primary maneuvering thrusters, designed for gentle station-keeping and asteroid capture, screamed under the strain, pushing the immense, now impossibly heavy vessel forward. Its velocity was pathetic, a snail's pace compared to the Cathar's agile scout ships, but every meter gained was a defiant breath. From their distant, arrogant pitch, the Cathar observed, their long-range tactical scans, precise to the nanometer, reported the deep driller's trajectory. Civilian vessel, crippled, erratic course, velocity, negligible, threat assessment, 0. The Cathar command, having pacified countless systems with their superior technology and predictable strategies, saw nothing new. They had encountered desperate, last-ditch efforts before, crude ramming attempts, frantic, uncoordinated fighter swarms. This was just another variation on a theme, a pathetic, dying twitch. Their algorithms, fed by millennia of data on conventional warfare, simply couldn't conceive of a weapon that wasn't designed to be one. They registered the continued, massive power fluctuations within the steep driller, but categorized them as critical system failures, the death throes of a failing fusion core, hull integrity, degrading, life support, intermittent, energy signatures, unstable. The data painted a picture of a vessel on the verge of implosion, not an attack. Inside the 8's deep driller, the air was thick with a silence born of profound tension. Every crew member was at their station, eyes fixed on flickering readouts, hands poised over controls. Eris Thorne, his gaunt face illuminated by the green glow of the primary plasma scourer console, ran through a dozen last-minute diagnostics. Power shunt from grav dampeners to forward arrays confirmed, he rasped, his voice hoarse. Auxiliary reactor bypass confirmed. We'll be running on fumes and prayers. The ship shuddered, a deep metallic groan echoing through the decks as the last vestiges of its comfort systems were stripped away, their energy diverted to the raw, destructive power building in its core. The very deck plates beneath their feet vibrated with the immense, barely contained energy. Kalen, a mountain of a man even when stooped, was in the kinetic accelerator bay. His hands, usually so gentle with delicate machinery, now gripped a massive lever. Centrifuge spin-up, 80% and climbing, he grunted, his voice strained. Magnetic containment holding. Barely. We've got enough mass in here to flatten a small moon, if we could get it to accelerate properly. The hum was no longer a hum, it was a bone-rattling roar, a physical force that pressed against their chests. The improvised ammunition, the jagged asteroid fragments, the compacted slag spun within the colossal chambers, a swirling vortex of impending doom, held in check only by the screaming magnetic fields. The sheer raw power required to achieve this was astronomical, pushing the ship's ancient reactors to their absolute limit. Jia Li, the geologist, was monitoring structural integrity, her brow furrowed in concentration. Every creak, every groan of the stressed hull was a data point. 4 aft stress fractures, within acceptable parameters for a short burst, she reported, her voice surprisingly calm. But anything sustained, we'll tear ourselves apart before they do. They were not just building a weapon, they were building a sacrifice that would scream its defiance across the void. Captain Elara Vance, standing at the central command console, watched the Cathar fleet grow larger in the main view screen. Their elegant formations, their casual, disdainful presence filled the void. One Cathar null cruiser, slightly detached from the main formation, began to turn, its primary weapon ports still sealed, its sensors still dismissive. It was likely sent to investigate the crippled civilian vessel more closely, perhaps to tractor it in for salvage, or simply to vaporize it when its systems finally failed. Target lock, null cruiser designation K7, Elara stated, her voice devoid of emotion, a cold, hard edge of resolve beneath it. Just the quiet, focused determination of people who had nothing left to lose. They had endured humiliation, seen their world brought to its knees, and watched their fleets burn. Now they were going to deliver a message forged in grit and sweat and a profound, stubborn human fury. The Cathar were about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the galaxy isn't a warship, but a mining vessel piloted by engineers who've simply had enough. The deep driller Maca Thirds was now within effective range, its crude, improvised weapons primed, its crew holding their breath. The Cathar, still blind to the true nature of the lumbering hulk approaching them, prepared for a simple clinical termination. They had scanned, they had analyzed, they had concluded, and they were about to be very, very wrong. The Cathar null cruiser, designated Harbinger of Silence, detached itself from the main formation, a predatory shark separating from its school. Its intent was clear, to perform a final, perfunctory scan, perhaps issue a derisive demand for surrender that would go unanswered, and then, with clinical efficiency, vaporize the crippled human vessel. Its internal comms buzzed with dispassionate analysis. Target K7, civilian vessel. No detected threat. Estimated time to terminal vaporization, 08 cycles. Recommend resource reclamation of wreckage, post-destruction. The Cathar commander, a multi-limbed being named Xylos, observed the approaching deep driller on his tactical display, a flicker of something akin to amusement rippling through his neural net. Humans. So primitive, so predictable in their desperate, futile struggles. Their advanced sensors, still registering only unstable energy signatures and non-combat mass shifts, had already filed the deep driller under derelict. The primary fusion core, pushed far beyond its operational limits, pulsed with a dangerous, unstable energy. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the metallic tang of overheating conduits. Every deck plate vibrated with a deep, resonant thrum, a physical manifestation of the immense, barely contained power building within the vessel. Warning lights flashed across every console, ignored. Alarms chirped, overridden. Eris Thorne, his face a mask of grim exhaustion, was in the main power junction, supervising the final energy shunt. All power to forward arrays. He barked, his voice raw. Grav dampeners offline. Life support minimal. Navigation running on reserve cells. Everything else feeds the scourers. The ship shuddered violently as the power flow rerouted, a massive surge of raw energy rushing towards the colossal plasma drills. The drills themselves, now glowing with a sickly internal blue light, hummed with an almost audible strain, their re-engineered focusing arrays straining against the immense power coursing through them. They were not designed for this. They were never designed for this. But necessity, forged in the crucible of humiliation, had twisted them into something monstrous. In the kinetic accelerator bays, Kalen, his muscles bulging with effort, wrestled with the final locking clamps on the centrifuge loading systems. Loading complete. He yelled over the deafening roar of the spinning chambers. All fragments secured, spin-up reaching critical velocity. The very hull around them buckled and groaned under the rotational forces. The improvised ammunition, the jagged asteroid fragments, the dense slag swirled within the magnetic containment fields, an impossible storm of raw kinetic energy barely held in check. The power draw from these centrifuges was astronomical, threatening to brown out the entire ship. But the potential devastation they represented was worth every risk. Jia Li, next to him, watched the stress fractures propagate across the bulkheads, her lips pressed into a thin line. Hull integrity holding, but barely. We get one shot, maybe two, before she tears herself apart. On the bridge, Captain Alara Vance stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the view screen. The Cathar harbinger of silence was now close enough to resolve individual hull plates, its sleek black form an emblem of alien superiority. Its own weapon ports remained sealed, its shields at minimum, utterly confident in its invulnerability against a crippled civilian vessel. The Cathar had sent no hails, no threats, just the silent, arrogant approach of a predator to its helpless prey. This casual disdain, this absolute certainty of victory, was the fuel for the deep driller's final, desperate surge. Target lock confirmed, a crew member reported, his voice tight with anticipation. K7's primary sensor array in optimal range. The S-deep driller, as was slow, but it was precise enough for this. It wasn't aiming for the bridge or the engines or any specific weapon system. It was aiming for the very heart of the Cathar's overconfidence, its sensor and communication arrays, its belief in its own infallible data. A low, guttural growl rose from the depths of the 5D deep driller, the sound of metal protesting, of power unleashed. The air shimmered. On the Cathar harbinger of silence, a single, almost imperceptible energy spike was registered by a peripheral sensor, immediately dismissed as environmental interference. No weapon signatures, no threat. Just a dying human ship, a minor anomaly in the grand, predictable sweep of Cathar conquest. But it wasn't an anomaly. It was the first breath of a storm. The deep driller. It was ready to prove that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the universe isn't what you can detect, but what you arrogantly dismiss. The Cathar harbinger of Silence X, still gliding forward with its predatory grace, initiated its final, perfunctory scan. Its primary sensor array, a complex web of hyperspectral detectors and gravimetric scanners, bathed the deep driller Mackay-3 in a cascade of invisible energy. The results flickered across the Cathar commander Xylos's tactical display. Hull integrity, 22%. Power output, erratic. Life support, critical. Weapon signatures, none. Threat assessment, confirmed 0. A faint, almost imperceptible ripple of satisfaction passed through Xylos's consciousness. Another human nuisance, neatly categorized, about to be eliminated. Then the 8 deep driller screamed. It wasn't a sound, not truly, but a massive, instantaneous surge of raw, untamed energy that ripped through the void. The primary fusion core, pushed to a point of near-catastrophic instability, dumped its entire output into the forward arrays. The colossal plasma scourers, once mining drills, ignited. Not with a focused beam, but with a torrent, a wide, boiling river of superheated plasma that erupted from the deep driller's maw. It was a chaotic, incandescent wave, a blistering hammer blow of coherent energy, wide enough to engulf the Cathar cruiser's forward section. On the bridge of the Harbinger of Silence, the primary view screen, accustomed to displaying neat digital readouts, suddenly flared with an impossible, blinding white. Alarms shrieked, belated and incoherent. The Cathar vessel's auto-defense systems, designed to intercept guided projectiles and pinpoint energy beams, found nothing to target. This wasn't a weapon. It was a localized, superheated inferno, a raw, uncontrolled blast of pure thermal energy. The plasma, roaring through the vacuum, slammed into the Harbinger of Silence with the force of a supernova. Its minimal shields, designed for stray micrometeoroids and atmospheric friction, shimmered for a nanosecond, then vaporized. The Cathar hull, sleek and impervious to conventional weaponry, began to melt. Not burn, not explode, but melt, like wax under a blowtorch. The superheated plasma scoured away the ablative ceramite, then the reinforced alloys beneath, exposing internal conduits and structural supports. The Cathar bridge, shielded by multiple layers of armor, still felt the heat, a sudden searing pressure that warped the very air. Xylos, for the first time in his long, conquering life, felt something akin to confusion, then a flicker of something colder, alarm. Before the Cathar could even process the impossible, non-weapon attack, the second, more devastating phase of the Besieged driller's assault began. The kinetic accelerators, screaming under the immense rotational forces, released their payloads, not in neat, targeted volleys, but in a brutal shotgun blast. Thousands of high-density asteroid fragments, ranging from gravel to multi-ton chunks of slag, were flung from the steep driller's flanks with unthinkable velocity. Each piece was spinning, tumbling, a jagged, improvised bullet. The Cathar Harbinger of Silence, still reeling from the plasma scourer's direct hit, was then engulfed in a storm of kinetic impacts. The fragments, too small and numerous for point defense lasers to track effectively, too fast for the crippled shields to regenerate, hammered into the cruiser's already compromised hull. It wasn't an elegant, strategic strike, it was a brutal, industrial shredding. Each impact sent a shockwave through the Cathar vessel. Hull plates buckled inward, internal bulkheads ruptured. Secondary explosions blossomed along the cruiser's length as the kinetic impacts detonated fuel lines, ruptured coolant systems, and tore through critical power conduits. The Cathar, designed for elegant, precise warfare, were being beaten to death by rock and refuse. Their advanced predictive algorithms, designed to counter sophisticated threats, were utterly useless against the sheer, unrefined brutality of the East Deep driller's attack. They had no counter for a mining vessel that simply decided to vomit its guts onto an enemy. On the H-Deep driller's bridge, Captain Alara Vance watched the Cathar cruiser convulse. The main view screen showed explosions blooming across its sleek hull, the elegant lines of the alien vessel twisting into grotesque contortions. The ship shuddered violently, the strain of its own weapons threatening to tear it apart. Alarms blared, confirming structural breaches, overheating systems, but no one moved to acknowledge them. Their eyes were fixed on the dying Cathar ship. The humiliation, the despair, the fear that had clung to them for cycles was burning away, replaced by a cold, savage satisfaction. The Harbinger of Silence was still intact, a ghost of its former self, but it was bleeding energy, its internal systems collapsing, its once pristine hull shredded and mangled. The Cathar, in their distant fleet, had finally registered the impossible. Their sensors, calibrated for combat, were now overwhelmed by the raw, unreadable chaos emanating from the engagement. They had seen a crippled civilian vessel approach. They were now watching a null cruiser being ripped apart by something that defied all their combat doctrine, all their logic. The Cathar were not just surprised. They were baffled. and for the first time a cold, alien fear began to ripple through their collective consciousness. The humans, the primitives, had just outsmarted them with a wrench and a rock. The Cathar harbinger of silence was no longer a sleek predator. It was a mangled husk, bleeding atmosphere and energy into the void. Its elegant black hull was pockmarked, cratered, and scorched, resembling a piece of discarded slag more than a warship. Internal explosions continued to blossom across its length, miniature supernovae tearing through its compromised decks. The primary sensor array, the very instrument that had dismissed the CD Drillerhay as a non-threat, was a twisted, molten ruin. On the Cathar flagship, the abyssal tyrant, a profound, chilling silence fell. Commander Xylus, having witnessed the impossible destruction of the Harbinger of Silence As, felt his neural net seize. The data was unequivocal. The null cruiser, designed to withstand sustained combat with dedicated warships, had been shredded by a civilian mining vessel. Their sophisticated tactical algorithms, which had flawlessly predicted every outcome in 1,000 campaigns, offered no explanation. The parameters simply did not exist for a threat that attacked with plasma meant for rock and projectiles made of waste. The Cathar fleet, previously holding its formation with disdainful confidence, now stirred. Subtle shifts in energy signatures rippled through the Black Armada as shields were brought to full power, weapon ports extended, and targeting arrays locked onto the deep driller, Mackay-3 section. The casual arrogance was gone, replaced by a cold, analytical assessment of the new, incomprehensible threat. Their long-range scans, still struggling to categorize the weapon signatures of the human vessel, now registered a chaotic, overwhelming output of thermal and kinetic energy. They didn't understand how, but they understood what had happened. A null cruiser was dead. Inside the S-Deep driller, the triumph was short-lived, replaced by a grim awareness of their own fragility. The ship was dying. The plasma scourers, having dumped their immense energy, glowed with residual heat. Their internal conduits melted and fused. The kinetic accelerators, having hurled their payloads, strained under the immense residual rotational forces, their magnetic containment fields flickering ominously. Every structural member groaned under the cumulative stress. Warning lights screamed across every panel, a symphony of catastrophic failure. Hull integrity, 11% and dropping. Aris Thorne, already working frantically at a sparking console, slammed his fist on a control panel. Divert emergency power from life support to containment field. We don't need air if we're a radioactive cinder. His face was slick with sweat and grime, but his eyes burned with a desperate, manic brilliance. They had wounded the beast, but they were bleeding out. The Cathar fleet began to move, not in a predictable, linear assault, but a more complex, intelligent pattern. 3 null cruisers broke formation, moving to flank the beat driller, their weapon ports now fully extended, glowing with the ominous hum of charged particle cannons. They were no longer dismissing the human vessel. They were treating it as a legitimate, if inexplicable, threat. Their long-range targeting systems, calibrated for speed and precision, would make short work of the ace-deep driller's now crippled, improvised defenses. Captain Elara Vance, though her ship was tearing itself apart around her, held her gaze steady on the approaching Cathar. They had bought time. They had delivered a message. Now they had to deliver the punchline. "Eris," she commanded, her voice surprisingly calm amidst the chaos. "Can we get one more shot from the kinetic accelerators, even a partial charge?" Thorne didn't hesitate. "Barely. The centrifuges are overloading, Captain. But we've got a few tons of dense ore still in the feed lines. It'll be a raw, uncontrolled burst, no targeting." "Good," Elara replied, a grim smile touching her lips. "We don't need targeting. We need a distraction. Kalen, how much charge can we get into the magnetic clamps?" Kalen, covered in hydraulic fluid, grunted. "Enough to rip an ore asteroid apart, Captain." "But what for?" Elara's eyes, cold and calculating, flickered to the main view screen, where the Cathar null cruisers were converging. "We're going to give them a final data point," she said, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. "Something for their algorithms to really chew on." It was a slow, agonizing turn, its maneuvering thrusters sputtering and dying. The Cathar, observing its erratic movements, interpreted it as a final, desperate attempt at evasion. They closed in, confident in their overwhelming numerical and technological superiority. They had finally grasped that this human vessel was dangerous, but they still believed it was operating within a predictable framework of combat. They still believed they understood the rules of engagement. They were still fundamentally wrong. The deep driller was not trying to escape. It was repositioning itself for one final, utterly illogical and devastating act of defiance. It was a dying beast, cornered, but with one last impossible bite left. The Cathar Null, cruisers, 3 sleek obsidian triangles of death, closed in on the steep driller, Mackay 3rd Ix. Their weapon ports glowed with the contained fury of particle cannons, their targeting arrays locking onto the human vessel with chilling precision. They saw a crippled, dying hulk, its energy signature spiraling into chaos, its hull integrity critical. Their algorithms, now updated to acknowledge a sporadic, unpredictable, but dangerous thermal kinetic threat, nevertheless predicted a swift, decisive annihilation. The deep driller was slow, its thrusters sputtering, its defensive screens utterly non-existent. It was a sitting target. Inside the deep driller, the air was thick with smoke and the acrid stench of burning electronics. Sparks rained from overhead conduits, the deck plates buckled. The ship was a dying animal, but it was not yet broken. Captain Alara Vance, braced against the main console, watched the Cathar close the distance. Her face was grim, but a fierce light burned in her eyes. "Kalen, now!" she commanded, her voice cutting through the cacophony of alarms. In the kinetic accelerator bay, Kalen, his face smeared with grease and blood, slammed the activation lever. The immense centrifuges, pushed past their breaking point, shrieked a final agonizing protest. With a deafening roar that ripped through the steep driller's structure, they spat their last, desperate payload. Not a focused volley, but a chaotic, untargeted storm of raw ore, fragmented asteroid, and slag. Thousands of tons of dense, irregular debris erupted from the deep driller's flanks, propelled by the dying scream of the magnetic containment fields. It wasn't an attack, it was a cloud. A dense, rapidly expanding cloud of high-velocity shrapnel, spreading outwards in a chaotic, unpredictable pattern directly into the path of the converging Cathar cruisers. The Cathar, their tactical systems honed for precise engagements, immediately registered the incoming swarm. Their auto-defense lasers, designed to intercept missiles and fighter craft, whirred to life, lancing out pinpoint beams of destruction. But the cloud was too dense, too chaotic. There was no single target, no predictable trajectory. Hundreds of thousands of fragments, tumbling and spinning, simply absorbed the laser fire, a kinetic shield of pure, unrefined chaos. Aris, magnetic clamps, full power. Alara roared. Thorn, at his console, wrestled with the dying power conduits, diverting remaining core power. Magnetic field fluctuating wildly. With a shudder that threatened to rip the ship apart, the big driller's colossal external magnetic clamps, usually used to secure multi-ton ore chunks for processing, activated. They pulsed with an immense, unstable energy reaching out into the void. They didn't target the Cathar, they targeted the very cloud of debris the steep driller had just launched. The Cathar watched, baffled. Their sensors registered the impossible. The human vessel was pulling the debris cloud towards itself. The chaotic shrapnel, instead of dissipating, began to coalesce, drawn by the immense, improvised magnetic fields of the East Deep driller. In moments, the crippled mining vessel became an armored singularity, a swirling, impossibly dense sphere of high-velocity rock and metal, churning around its core. It was a crude, temporary shield, yes, but also a weapon, a kinetic maelstrom. The Cathar Null cruisers, their particle cannons charged, opened fire. Their precise, focused beams, designed to punch through layered composite armor, struck the swirling mass of the steep driller's improvised shield. But the beams, instead of finding a solid target, dissipated harmlessly into the churning debris, deflected, absorbed, or simply deflected by the unpredictable, ever-shifting impacts. Each fragment of rock, each chunk of slag, became a tiny kinetic shield, absorbing a fraction of the incoming energy, then spinning away, replaced by another. The Cathar's advanced weapons, designed for surgical strikes, were rendered useless against a defense that was nothing but a chaotic industrial mess. It was like trying to punch water. Hull integrity, zero, GLE whispered, her voice a mix of awe and despair. We're losing atmosphere. Reactor containment failing any second. But Captain Alara Vance wasn't looking at her readouts. She was looking at the Cathar. The null cruisers, unable to penetrate the de-driller's improvised defense, were now caught in a terrible dilemma. They could retreat, or they could risk closing to point-blank range, where their weapons might finally find purchase. But the deep driller was a ticking time bomb, a fusion core seconds from catastrophic overload, wrapped in a swirling cocoon of kinetic shrapnel. Then the deep driller Mackay, Thigh Third, shuddered one last colossal time. The primary fusion core, having been pushed beyond all known limits, achieved terminal overload. It didn't explode in a clean, contained blast. It ripped itself apart, a contained supernova of superheated plasma and gamma radiation. The magnetic clamps, still holding the immense, swirling debris field, imploded, turning the chaotic shield into a focused radial wave of kinetic energy. The fish-deep driller A vanished in a blinding flash of light, but the Cathar null cruisers, too close, were not spared. The raw fusion energy, combined with the instantaneous outward acceleration of thousands of tons of superheated shrapnel, slammed into their flanks. One null cruiser, the S Blade of Conquest, had its shields overloaded and its hull shredded by the sudden, overwhelming kinetic blast, its internal systems collapsing as the improvised shrapnel tore through its core. It spiraled out of control, a dying starship. The other two, caught on the periphery, were battered, their shields flickering, their external sensor arrays melted, their weapon systems momentarily crippled. The Cathar fleet, watching from a safe distance, registered the impossible. A second null cruiser annihilated, not by a warship. Not by a weapon, they understood, but by a dying mining vessel that had just turned itself into a kinetic grenade. Their collective neural nets reeled. Their algorithms, fed by millennia of predictable conflict, suddenly crashed. They had never encountered such a thing. A race that, when cornered, would turn its very tools of industry into instruments of such raw, unrefined, and utterly illogical destruction. A race that would not just die, but would spite its death, weaponizing its own demise. On the Cathar flagship, the Abyssal Tyrant, Commander Xylos felt the cold, creeping tendrils of a new, alien emotion, not just surprise, but fear. This was not warfare as they knew it. This was something else, something primal, something terrifyingly human. The humans had no warships left, but they had something far more dangerous. They had a profound, stubborn, and utterly unpredictable refusal to simply lose. A final, faint human broadcast, distorted by the static of a dying comm buoy, pulsed through the void. It was a single, cold, sarcastic message, delivered with the unyielding resolve of a species that had just shown the galaxy its teeth. Next time, check the blueprints. And the Cathar, for the first time in their conquering history, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold vacuum of space.